On January 5, 1942, while victory celebrations still echoed through Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto ordered the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to prepare plans for the second phase of operations in the Pacific. His review of reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and other southern theaters convinced him that, within months, Japanese forces would dominate the captured regions. Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Mado Magaki, that he wanted completed operational plans by mid-February. The speed of Japan's early conquests stunned planners in Tokyo and exposed sharp divisions inside the Imperial General Staff. Zealous military expansionists urged relentless advance, no matter how far. Yamamoto, who had been deeply ambivalent about war with Britain and the United States, warned of a different path. Friends on the general staff had feared for his safety in Tokyo because of his cautious views. While at sea aboard the combined fleet flagship Yamato, he was safer from assassination attempts. Even then, Yamamoto's counsel for far-sighted statesmanship was well known, and Agaki recorded that warning in his diary. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had confided in Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the right-wing Kokusuki, that political decisions had made war likely. He predicted an early period of sweeping success, the octopus spreading its tentacles, but he also warned that the euphoria would be short-lived. Yamamoto believed that after a decisive victory, such as the fall of Singapore, Britain might seek terms and pressure for peace. From his time at the London Naval Conferences and as naval attaché in Washington, 1926–28, he knew Western minds and judged that Japan had only a limited window of opportunity. He told Sasakawa that if Japan could secure a spectacular success, it might bargain for peace before a prolonged struggle exhausted its resources. By January 1942, much seemed to have gone Japan's way. The U.S. battleship fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, British capital ships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk, Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite were in Japanese hands, Hong Kong had fallen, and landings were underway across the Dutch East Indies, New Ireland, Ambon, and parts of the Solomons. Yet Pearl Harbor had not achieved everything Yamamoto had hoped. The American carriers were at sea and remained an ongoing threat. What Yamamoto sought was an even more decisive, public triumph, one that would strengthen Japan's bargaining position. Yamamoto favored operations that would create such a political opening. He proposed, among other options, a Japanese push into the Indian Ocean, a campaign to draw out and destroy Britain's Far Eastern Fleet, and then press on toward the Middle East to secure oil fields. The army refused to entertain a Middle Eastern campaign because its forces were tied down in China and Southeast Asia. Other plans under consideration included an Australian campaign to seize forward bases, New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa. But Yamamoto distrusted that approach as too slow and insufficiently spectacular. He pushed instead for a plan to strike at Midway, a carrier battle intended to neutralize the U.S. carrier force, and also sent an AL plan envisioning operations through Alaska toward the North American continent. These ideas were intended to produce dramatic results that could be used to negotiate peace. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, came sooner than Yamamoto had expected and initially appeared to vindicate Japanese strategy. Yet other events quickly undercut any assumption of long-term security. The April Doolittle Raid, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's bombing of Tokyo, shocked Japan and made clear that American resolve was just beginning. Then came Midway in June. The carrier battle turned into a catastrophe for Japan. 4 fleet carriers were lost. The defeat was so strategically crushing that the full scope was suppressed and known only at the highest naval levels. While Yamamoto had been campaigning for bold plans, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo was already moving forces south to support the next round of operations aimed at cutting off Australia. From January onward, Japanese forces seized Rabaul and then mounted continual reconnaissance and bombing operations across the islands and New Guinea. The Japanese occupation of Rabaul on January 23 became a forward hub for further southward moves. Allied leaders responded. The American and Australian commands watched Japanese advances with alarm. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in the theater in March, he warned Canberra of an imminent threat to Australia and requested reinforcements. Washington, however, had limited naval resources. Admiral Ernest J. King said only 2 carriers could be counted on before the end of June. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, anticipated a major Japanese move and suspected that Midway would be a focal point, a prediction borne out in June. As Midway raged, Japanese forces pressed to secure bases in the New Guinea and Solomon Islands area. The South Seas Force under Major General Tomitaro Horii landed at Salamaua and seized Tulagi, constructing a seaplane base there. The Imperial General Staff in Tokyo concurrently planned an operation against Port Moresby, a key Allied base on the New Guinea coast. With Yamamoto expected to return with a combined fleet after Midway, planners envisioned carrier support for an advance that would threaten Australia's northern approaches. The American High Command debated how best to halt Japanese expansion. MacArthur advocated an immediate offensive against New Britain and New Ireland, followed by an assault on Rabaul and eventual operations to retake the Solomons and New Guinea. He asked for 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. General Marshall modified the request to 3 carriers and multiple divisions. Admiral King, wary of risk and the vulnerability of carriers to land-based attack, proposed a defensive line and a phased offensive through the Solomons under naval command, a plan that would place Admiral Robert L. Gormley in charge of the South Pacific. King's approach required fewer forces up front and emphasized defending Australia while building amphibious capability. Admiral Gormley left Washington on May 1 to take command. In Pearl Harbor and Wellington, preparations accelerated. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner was detached to command amphibious training and preparation. Marine and Army units began practicing landings. Many commanders were skeptical. Amphibious doctrine was untested at scale, resources were limited, and coordination problems were pervasive. Japanese reconnaissance soon showed Allied activity in the Solomons area. By late July, American planners saw the danger, but intelligence failures and miscommunications left the most obvious approach, the narrow sea lane called the slot, insufficiently covered. The Japanese had completed an airfield on Guadalcanal by the end of July. On August 14th, Yamamoto ordered initial air operations from Rabaul forward, and by early August, Japanese air groups were repositioned for operations against the Solomons. Despite intelligence gaps, the Allies moved. In late July, a hurried rehearsal at Kororo Island revealed the inexperience of many units. Only a third of assigned troops managed to land during practice. Logistical difficulties, including poor staging at underprepared ports, hampered the buildup. Yet Washington insisted the operation proceed without delay. On August 6 to 7, 1942, a U.S. task force of some 75 ships steamed toward the Solomons in a covert approach. As dawn broke on August 7, after rain squalls and poor visibility, carrier planes launched strikes against the Japanese position. Aircraft from the carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and others hit Tulagi, Gavutu, and nearby islets. They destroyed Japanese seaplanes, strafed installations, and bombed troop concentrations. The initial raids achieved complete surprise. Marine landing forces went ashore on Guadalcanal and nearby islands that morning. At some points, notably the main Guadalcanal landing, resistance was light or absent because defenders had fled inland. But on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the Americans encountered fierce resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson's raiders and elements of the 2nd Marines met determined Japanese defenders who held strong positions in the jungle and on ridgelines. The fighting there was brutal. Entrenched machine gun nests, snipers in trees, dugouts and caves that required grenades, dynamite, and close assaults to clear. The Japanese, though surprised, rapidly dispatched air forces from Rabaul. A large formation of twin-engine Betty bombers and their Zero escort set out to strike the invasion fleet. They were intercepted by American carrier fighters. The ensuing air battles were intense. U.S. pilots, flying F-4F Wildcats, suffered losses but adapted tactics, using pairs to concentrate fire and exploit the Wildcats' ruggedness, while Japanese Zeros remained formidable in maneuver but were vulnerable to concentrated American firepower. On Tulagi, the raiders faced savage counterattacks and suicide resistances that shocked American troops and used to the Japanese doctrine of fighting to the last. Casualties mounted. Tulagi took many lives before the island was secured by the second day. Gavutu and Tanambogo proved exceedingly costly. The Japanese had fortified the seaplane bases, and the Marines suffered heavy losses during the landings and subsequent assaults to eliminate enemy positions dominating the beaches and causeways. As the landings consolidated, Japanese naval commanders scrambled to respond. Rear Admiral Gishimawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, sent cruisers south from Rabaul to try to strike the invasion. A convoy attempting to reinforce Guadalcanal was intercepted, and one transport, the Meo Maru, was sunk by an Allied submarine, further complicating Japanese relief efforts. Admiral Fletcher, commanding the American carrier forces protecting the landings, was cautious. He limited his exposure and withdrew carriers after a short period of close air cover, a decision that worried the amphibious commanders, who feared lack of sustained air protection. Admiral Turner and General Vandergrift pressed on with building supply dumps and extending beachheads despite logistical congestion. The next days saw increased air activity. Large Japanese bombing raids were intercepted, and many enemy bombers were shot down, yet attackers managed to strike transports, causing damage and casualties. On August 8, Japanese torpedo and dive bomber attacks sank or damaged Allied ships, while carrier-based and land-based fighters continued to contest control of the skies. The fighting revealed the limits and strengths of both sides. Japanese pilots displayed excellent airmanship and range capability, but American tactics and the tenacity of ground troops began to blunt that edge. Throughout the campaign, the Allies wrestled with imperfect intelligence and coordination. Coast watchers, reconnaissance flights, and intercepted radio traffic played roles, but were not always heeded. Still, the invasion yielded strategic gains. Marines secured Henderson Field, the airstrip on Guadalcanal that would become a critical and fiercely contested asset, and by late August, Allied ground forces had established a foothold from which to contest Japanese efforts to dominate the southern approaches to Australia. The initial Guadalcanal and Tulagi operations marked the beginning of a long, costly campaign through the Solomons and New Guinea, a campaign that would test amphibious doctrine, inter-service cooperation, naval air power, and the limits of logistic sustainment. The early days revealed both the ferocity of Japanese defense and the determination of American and Australian forces to stop the southern thrust. Commanders on both sides adapted rapidly, learning hard lessons about carrier support, the demands of island warfare, and the centrality of airfields in the Pacific struggle.